What's up everyone, Dylan here. I wanted to hop on to do another episode of the weekly analysis video. The last video I posted was back on November 25th, which was 2 weeks ago, and a lot has happened since then. So let's kind of back up to where we were 2 weeks ago, and then I'll kind of get into where we're at now. Okay, so very important. I wanted to go over the critical line on the NASDAQ. Okay, this is a line that I've talked about in some of the last few videos that I've posted, and it remains probably the most important line on all of my charts. Okay, basically what I've been saying very, very simply, as long as the NASDAQ stays above that line, the longer term trend remains up. Very simple. Okay, no need to overcomplicate that. Okay, so the last time I posted was on November 25th, which was right around here, right around this price action here. 2 days after that, what did the NASDAQ do? It got right down to that critical line and bounced. Since bouncing there, it had went on to make all-time highs. So hopefully that was helpful for some of the folks that are watching these videos and had that on their charts. Okay, so not only did it bounce right near that area, but it also went on, like I said, to make all-time highs with the S&P 500 as well. So since then, there has been a very, very clear uptrend. Okay, in fact, this is a crazy statistic. As of Friday, okay, so as of last session, the S&P 500 futures put in higher highs 14 days in a row. That's pretty insane. That does not happen often. Meaning, at some point during the day, for 14 days straight, the S&P took out a previous day high. Does not mean that it closed above the previous day high, but at some point during the session, it took out previous day's highs. Okay, so clearly, like I said, higher highs, higher lows, all the way up for about 2 to 3 weeks, right? Clear uptrend. Okay, and it's been a pretty broad rally as well, meaning there has been some single stock names that have been making all-time highs. Some of the large mega cap names, right? Apple, all-time highs today, right? Amazon, all-time highs today. What else? We had Meta make all-time highs within the last week. We had Netflix making, I don't know if it was all-time highs. Yeah, all-time highs, right? So there have been some mega cap names that have been leading the market higher, which is very, very helpful. Okay, so now where are we currently? Okay, I wanted to post this or show this for transparency. Despite the last 3 weeks being very, very clear uptrend, I started to see some signs of exhaustion in the market, and as a result, I took the VIX long. This was posted on Friday, right? The previous session at 1:21 p.m. Eastern time. I said, hey, just scaled into a starter position in VIX futures at 1430, right? Basically, what I was implying was, hey, I think the market is due for a little bit of a pullback. I'm not, could it crash from here? Yeah. Do I think it's going to crash? No, by no means. But I was looking for a little bit of a pullback, and since then we have gotten very, very small one, but I would not be surprised if it continues to the downside, and I'll get into it. So where did I post it? I posted that alert when price was right around here. Okay, so since then, S&P's down about 40 handles. Like I said, nothing crazy. Okay, why did I think that? Okay, let's get into it. So first off, there's two pretty similar trend lines. S&P 500 futures has one, and then the NASDAQ futures have one as well. The S&P one stems from July of this year, whereas the NASDAQ one stems from November of 2021. It's a 3-year-old trend line. So let me go ahead and draw these. Okay, so for the S&P, like I said, it stems from July of this year. Okay, and then for the NASDAQ, I got to go on a daily chart for this one. You go all the way back to November of 2021. Okay, and you attach it to the high of July 2024. Okay, and you could see the last 2 sessions tested there. Okay, so Friday tested there, and then last night during Sunday night's reopen, it also tested there as well, and that's exactly where it had failed. So it basically went from the critical support line up to the critical resistance line, okay? And do we fill out and move down to the critical support line again? Who knows? Maybe, right? I have no idea. But you could see if we look at, say a 6 hour, it doesn't matter what time frame you look at it, but ultimately sellers stepped in at and slightly above that trend line stemming all the way back to 2021. Okay, so with the S&P, it never quite got there. It missed it by like within 5 points, like 3 different times. So technically, it never hit, it never tested, but it got pretty damn close each of those times. Okay, another chart I wanted to point out was MTUM. Right, this is the momentum ETF. Simply put, MTUM, the performance of it is closely tied to overall market momentum. It tends to outperform during strong market uptrends, and then it may underperform during downtrends. Okay, so essentially, just look at this and visual momentum in the overall market. Okay, this thing had a trend line as well, so I'm going to go ahead and draw that for you guys. Okay, let me see if I could get this the way I have it before. Okay, so let's go on. We'll go on a daily chart. You could see this thing has been rejecting this general trend line all the way since March of 2024 with multiple tests, right? Several tests. All right, drop this down a little bit. OCD. Okay, so one thing that I wanted to point out, and this is the case on MTUM, S&P, and the NASDAQ, and then there's some things that I saw in the VIX as well. But what I wanted to point out was the RSI. Not only did S&P, NASDAQ, and momentum hit areas of resistance, but they also had some RSI divergences as well. So price on these went higher, right? They made higher highs, whereas the RSI was downtrending. Okay, and what that means is as the underlying instrument went higher in price, the relative strength was declining, right? Meaning, which implies that if it tests an area of resistance, it has a higher probability of failing at that area of resistance because the relative strength is weaker. Okay, so MTUM had that RSI divergence, as well as the S&P as well made higher highs, but notice how the RSI came down pretty aggressively. Okay, so you could see this high here in the RSI was much lower than the previous highs on the RSI, right? Which is the divergence and basically implies what I just said beforehand. Okay, same deal here. NASDAQ RSI went down, whereas the underlying price went up. Okay, so there were multiple signs of exhaustion in the market amongst ES, NASDAQ, and the overall momentum. On top of that, Apple has been relatively strong, but look how stretched it is on the RSI. Right, you could see it's coming up to this RSI up here. Right, I'm going to go ahead and draw a resistance area that it has failed at back in June and July of 2024 when the RSI hit 79. That's usually the topping point. Okay, so far right now the RSI is at 76.93, so it's very, very close to hitting that 79. I'm assuming that once it does hit that 79, that will then in turn cause somewhat of a pullback. Okay, could I be wrong? Of course, but using historical data, that is what it has done in the past, so why wouldn't it happen again in the future? Who knows? Okay, so definitely keep an eye on that going forward too. Another thing I saw was RSP. RSP is the equal weighted ETF of the S&P 500, as if the 11 sectors that make up the S&P were all equally weighted. Okay, you can see this thing topped out about a week before the S&P did. So the S&P topped out on Friday, but the RSP topped out on the Friday 1 week before this recent Friday. Okay, you could see it has had consecutive red days, which basically, in my eyes, with the S&P, the NASDAQ, and MTUM all having those divergences at resistance, the RSP gave me another piece of context because the broader stock market was declining. Okay, so there's something called the advanced and decline indicator, where it basically measures how many stocks advance in a day relative to how many stocks decline in a day. And basically what that indicator was showing was the vast majority of stocks in the stock market were declining as the S&P and the NASDAQ were continuing to make new highs, meaning the broader momentum of the overall stock market was getting pretty exhausted because it was so concentrated. The basket of stocks that were outperforming was so concentrated. So, right, what I just mentioned in the Apple, if this thing starts to come off, this has been something that has been helping and been outperforming in the overall market and been helping leading sentiment. So if you take that away, right, when that we can imply that the overall market will suffer if that were to occur, right? That is where my head is at. So going forward, where am I looking at for this pullback to kind of stop at? Okay, for starters, I am looking at this trend line. This trend line was key resistance until it broke out above. Since it broke out above, it has not been retested. So this is on the NASDAQ. Right now, this line lines up right with 21,368. Okay, so, or 21,370, I should say. So 21,370 on the NASDAQ lines up with previous resistance. Now support, who knows, but I will be looking at it to see if price can bounce there. Okay, and it's important because the NASDAQ has been relatively stronger in recent weeks. So technically, the relatively stronger name should bounce at a area of support. Okay, and then for the S&P, I want to look at the 50% retracement between the November 19th lows and the recent December 6th highs. Okay, this lines up with 59.83. So if the NASDAQ is unable to bounce there, I would then look at the S&P 500 futures to bounce at 59.80, or I'm then going to look at the price action around 59.83 on the S&P 500 futures. And if that doesn't hold, then then I transition my focus to something lower than that. Okay, excuse the noise in the background. So that is where I stand currently. Okay, so another thing to look at, other than those two downside levels in the S&P and the NASDAQ, is SOX. SOX is the Philadelphia Semiconductor Index, right? It is a composite index filled with some of the key, semiconductor names, okay? And a lot of people say that it is high beta, meaning it is very, very influential, right? There's a saying that goes, where stocks go, stocks goes, okay? So this thing tends to move in the same direction as the NASDAQ, or it tends to lead the NASDAQ, as I should say. So it has been holding the $5,000 psychological whole number recently. So I would continue to look at 5,000 as a good gauge. That is exactly where it gapped down into this morning, tested it, and then kind of, rallied off of it and then kind of flirted with it during the rest of the day. So if 5,000 breaches on SOX, I would like to imagine that the NASDAQ will come under some pressure and ultimately come down to retest that trend line, okay? So that is it for me. I will talk to you guys next week. Peace.